Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our spring seminar series. This series features leading experts on China from around the globe, speaking on a variety of topics centered around China's economy and institutions.
Yes, thanks. Thank you, Heather. And I'm really happy to be able to introduce today's speaker, Professor Albert Park. I'm going to do this very formally. He is a development and labor economist, an expert on China's economic development. He's the head and chair professor of economics, chair professor of social science, professor of public policy, and director of the Center of Economic Policy at Hong Kong University of Science and Tech. That's a mouthful. I couldn't remember. Now, what Albert really is my first PhD student ever. And when he graduated from Stanford with a PhD from the Food Research Institute and got a job in Michigan, and really was the first US economist that pioneered work on poverty in China, and did some very, very interesting work. And since then, he moved after he got tenure at Michigan. He was at Oxford for many years, and moved, like last year. I think it's almost 10 years ago that he moved to Hong Kong. And time moves fast. Albert, is in all of top media sources around the world. He's published articles in the leading economic journals on firm performance, poverty and inequality, migration, employment, health and education, aging in China. He works very closely with his Chinese collaborators and has mentored just uncountable, very top economists in China. One thing, he belongs at SCCEI. He has played a leadership role in numerous research projects in China. The China Employer-Employee Survey, alongside our co-director Li Hongbin, his work on robots was part of that. The China Urban Labor Survey, the Gansu Survey of Children and Families, the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Survey. Charles, he helped establish that and has been part of it ever since. I could go on and on. Albert, let's get started. I should say one more thing is, when we first started SCCEI, we had 5 topics that we thought were really important about China's economy and economic relations with the rest of the world, that we really needed to promote because we didn't know where any work was done on this. One was Belt and Road Initiative. And then when we asked Albert to give a seminar, he says, well, I'm doing empirical work on Belt and Road. So Albert, Professor Park, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So let me share my screen. Nice to see everybody. This actually is a topic which isn't maybe what you'd expect from me. A lot of my research is much more kind of a applied micro based on labor force surveys or household surveys or firm surveys. And this is looking at China's outbound investments. I was the director of an Institute for Emerging Market Studies at HKUST for a number of years. And as director there, we had a couple of multi-year research projects on the Belt and Road, one funded by the Hong Kong government, and another a collaboration with United Overseas Bank, which is the largest bank in Southeast Asia. And so that was directing a team of researchers looking at various aspects of the Belt and Road. And for that project, I kind of took main responsibility for doing some quantitative analysis, trying to assemble a project level data set where we could study some of the patterns and determinants of Chinese outbound FDI before and after the Belt and Road Initiative. And from that, other ideas came up, and it's led to some kind of spillover, spin-off projects, I guess. And so I want to just draw from a number of those projects to ask some broad questions about the Belt and Road Initiative. And I am not going to be too technical. I think I was told it's an interdisciplinary audience. So I'm going to focus mainly on the framing the questions and presenting the key findings. But if there are specific questions about methodology, by all means, please ask, and I'm happy to go into more detail. Okay. Oops. All right, so this is kind of roadmap for the talk. I want to talk a little bit about how we should think about the Belt and Road Initiative. There's obviously been a lot of polarized commentary about it. And then I want to present 3 types of evidence about what's going on if we look at the quantitative evidence. One is to present some results on the determinants of outbound foreign direct investment before and after the Belt and Road Initiative, aggregating the project level data up to the country year level and trying to understand where money is going from China to different countries under the initiative. And then next I want to talk about the role of state-owned enterprises because there's a lot of commentary that this is all state-led, that it's really the SOEs that are kind of operating at the behest of the Chinese government to achieve these objectives. But you know, to date, I haven't seen any data really that tries to quantify how much of the investment is actually coming from state enterprise. So we did quite a lot of linking data work to be able to quantify that and to look at how the nature of FDI from state-owned enterprises may differ from the investment coming from private enterprises. And finally, and these results are very preliminary and brand new off the press, I've never presented them. I want to present some evidence on how the initiative is affecting China's soft power based on some sentiment analysis of like 1 million media articles in different countries around the world about China and how the initiative may be affecting the way countries are perceiving China. And I'll just conclude with some thoughts about where I think China needs to focus on the initiative in terms of doing a better job on the initiative in the years to come. Okay. Now, this is the Belt and Road map. Probably many of you have seen it. The Silk Road economic belt is the overland route, trade routes, and the maritime Silk Road is actually the sea routes, trade routes. And on the right, you see a map of the countries that were designated as Belt and Road countries early on in the initiative. So initially, China designated about 60 plus countries as being kind of members or countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, but later it opened it up to anybody who wanted to be part of the initiative could be part of the initiative. And since then, China signed like 137 agreements with different countries. But for the purpose of analysis here, we're going to focus really on the initial countries, which are the countries which received more of the investment in the years that our data cover. Okay, so this is just a list of some of the milestone in the timeline of the development of the Belt and Road for those who may not be familiar. Xi Jinping very intentionally announced the belt part in Kazakhstan, and he announced the maritime road part in Indonesia, all in 2013. And this was followed by the establishment of some new institutions, such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Silk Road Fund, partly intended, I think, to support the Belt and Road Initiative, but not really fully coordinated with it. And then in 2015, the government released some detail on what they really were intending to do under the plan. And they had the first summit in Beijing attended by 29 heads of state. And this is an event that occurred again in 2019. And in Hong Kong, we also started annual Belt and Road summits, not so much for political leaders, but for businessmen. So it's really a business networking event for companies that want to become active in the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's a huge event every year. We have a group that attends, and it's very interesting to see the discussion from leaders from different countries in the region, and also the perspective of different business people. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple of slides just to think through why we might be optimistic about the impacts of the Belt and Road and the success of it, and then why we might be pessimistic before I kind of turn to the empirical analysis. So One thing that's definitely true is that a lot of money is being spent on this initiative. There's a lot of projects that are occurring that are at various stages of development. So there really has been a large-scale mobilization of resources with generous financing terms from China. And I think the debt trap arguments may have relevance in a country here and there, but I think has pretty much been debunked by people who actually look at the evidence. That this is, I don't think, the main intent, and also not a very common kind of feature of the Belt and Road Initiative. So in some countries, for instance, like one of our old friends from Stanford, Lee Gua, was telling us that, in Pakistan, which is one of the biggest recipients of the Belt and Road Initiative, it's been transformative, the amount of projects and the basic infrastructure that's been built since the initiative began. And I think, having visited a number of the countries in Southeast Asia and doing interviews with, various stakeholders, in that region of the world, most of the governments are kind of, I think you could call them developmental states, and that the government is putting a pretty high priority on trying to think of ways to develop the economies. And all of them are thinking about how to incorporate Chinese projects into their own strategic development planning. And I think it's certainly presents them with options that might not be available in the absence of the initiative.
So
now, you
Albert,
could argue,
Albert, can I ask, none of this is debt financed?
A lot of projects are debt financed, but the Chinese government usually offers very generous, very low interest rates. And in cases where there's repayment problems, just like a lot of their early involvement in Africa, they'll write off some of those loans or refinance them. They will generally not be trying to come in and be predatory in terms of how they deal with those loans. So I don't think it's been discussed a lot in the case of Sri Lanka and others. I have a colleague here who's done really a lot of research on those cases. And most of the times, the projects, the large projects that create debt problems, usually they're not the ideas of the Chinese side. I think they're usually more the ideas of the local governments. They want to do these projects, and they maybe not even smartly, they want to do this project. And I think sometimes China has gone ahead with them, and also maybe when they shouldn't have, because basically they're bad projects. I mean, I'm not really going to defend the quality of the projects China is doing, because I think and I'll show you some evidence in a minute that they don't seem to be driven by economic fundamentals. So, and I think many of them maybe, have had difficulty. But that's different than saying the goal of the program is somehow to trap governments to become dependent. Although, people obviously have different views. And finally, I think it's worth pointing out that from a developmental perspective, Chinese firms can provide some valuable features that are not just the money. Many Chinese firms have just gone through rapid development in a kind of a labor-intensive factor price environment. And so a lot of the technologies that they have available are more appropriate for other developing countries. And of course, Chinese firms have learned to survive and be productive in very challenging institutional environments as well, which is a feature of many less developed countries. Okay, that's the optimistic side. And if people have violent objections, please feel free to voice them. But let me get to the pessimistic side. And this looks like a longer list, actually. I think as a development economist, we're very familiar with the arguments that money doesn't buy development. The Easterly work, some other work by folks at the World Bank. There have been longstanding debates about aid and growth in development. And that work has generally found very weak evidence or no evidence that giving a country more foreign assistance promotes growth. Now, some people have focused on governance, saying, well, if it's a well-governed country and you give them aid, then you get some benefits. And there's some papers that have made that argument. Those results tend to be a bit fragile, I think, but that's certainly a principle that many aid agencies now kind of consider in thinking about where they put their money and when. Now, in addition to that, we know that to do successful projects, it's just a very painstaking job in terms of identifying projects, appraising them, implementing them, evaluating them. You really need to do a lot of due diligence, especially for projects in less developed countries with maybe weaker institutions and other kind of risk factors. Businesses are very cautious typically about making investments in many of the countries that are Belt and Road countries. And we also know that there's a nice narrative where you might think, oh, if China builds the infrastructure, then those countries can attract a ton of FDI and that'll really help their economies, just like China attracted a lot of FDI. But even China took decades to be successful in attracting FDI, and many countries try to attract FDI unsuccessfully. So it's not really so easy. And down below, I also argue that there is this competition for FDI in export markets. It's hard for everyone to be winners in the kind of global value chain or investment game. Now, there's also in quite a few countries some political sensitivity to Chinese investment. I think in any country, if you have a lot of money coming from one country, there's a concern that will create kind of some type of dependence. And in the case of the Belt and Road projects, there are many examples where I would say kind of questionable projects that are harmful to the environment, or where labor regulations are not strictly followed, or the way that Chinese companies kind of deal with counterparts is not really the way that those countries are used to doing business. Those often have been exploited by opponents or by various groups to really criticize China and lead to kind of negative sentiment towards the Chinese engagement in those countries. And finally, they're really, yeah, sure.
The word environmental is a trigger word for me. So
yes,
how seriously, I'm not sure even how to ask the question. What kind of authority what kind of governance is being introduced to consider the externalities associated with the investments? To what extent is this a serious problem?
I think it has been a serious problem. I think it's getting better at the summit, the international summit in Beijing in 2019. Xi Jinping addressed these criticisms of the Belt and Road Initiative and said that we have to do a better job making sure that the projects are green. I know the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank now puts that as a point of emphasis in their project approval process. But that said, and of course, there's the local governments have a primary responsibility as well for environmental regulation and making these decisions. It's not like China is forcing them to do anything. But that said, I don't think there's a very clear or strict governance process that will make Chinese investing companies have to consider those things. I think they've learned, and they are learning, that it's not very effective for them when they do a project and there's pollution and then there's protests from local constituencies or organizations. It really often harms the project itself. It will get delayed or disrupted. And I think they're learning that. So a lot of the big energy companies in China are trying to do more, I think. And we have evidence of that in the work we've done, that they're doing more renewable projects relatively, but China is still, you know, this was, I think, I read in the news discussed, you know, by Biden at the recent climate conference, that a big issue is China is one of the only countries that continues to finance coal-powered power in other countries. And I think, you know, that's something that they've done. Some of the places where they've been doing those investments are coal-abundant countries where, you know, it's very costly not to use the coal that you have. So that has happened, I think, more so in the earlier years, I think less so now, as it's gotten more scrutiny, and perhaps China will stop funding the carbon. I think there's a lot of international pressure to stop doing that. But you know, we'll have to see. I mean, I interviewed an engineering company executive, a Chinese engineering company that is doing a lot of energy projects, and they said that their strategy is to switch to much more to renewable projects in the Belt and Road countries, because they found that it's a headache to deal with environmental concerns. So this speaks to kind of one of my main complaints about how China has approached the initiative. I think they've kind of tried to support whatever the local governments want to do, even when the local governments are not really governing in a responsible way. And I think China has gotten into a lot of trouble by doing that. And I think they need to be self-governing and self-policing on these things if they want the initiative not to run into quite a lot of international criticism and local criticism in the countries where they're active. I think they're learning those lessons. I think there's some evidence of that, but maybe not as fast as we'd like. Okay. I want to make sure I get to the evidence. So, you know, there's this Western view of China as exploiting poor countries. And of course, the Chinese view is very benevolent, that they're just trying to support their neighbors to develop their economies, win-win. The view that's actually often not discussed in a lot of the commentary is the views of the countries themselves, who are probably the primary actors who will determine how the project gets implemented and what its impacts will be. And I think the agency of the countries themselves is really important. I think it's become, when we've done research, you know, through doing case studies in different countries, you know, we've really focused on that as trying to understand how the local governments are managing the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think quite a lot of them that have some capability or capacity are doing okay. You know, they're balancing the Chinese interests with other foreign investors. They're incorporating they're creating structures to carefully govern and monitor the project choices that are done with China. Of course, there are some examples where bad projects are being done and then renegotiated and people are complaining, but I think those are the ones that get more media attention. Okay, so this just repeats the other questions I want to look at. Okay, let me just move to the evidence. Okay, and I'm going to skip this too. I'm just going to go right to it. So one of the issues, the challenges to doing research on China's outbound FDI is that if you look at China's official statistics on outbound FDI, almost, you know, 3/4 of the FDI goes through Hong Kong or other tax haven countries. And the final destination is just not known in the official data, right? And of course, you can still look at the flows, the direct flows to different countries, but you're just missing most of the FDI. So the alternative is to use project level data. And in this project, we draw from two sources. One is the Global Investment Tracker, China Global Investment Tracker, run by Derek Scissors at the American Enterprise Institute, who I actually went to high school with. Kind of random. And then the other is the Financial Times FDI market data set. The AEI data has all types of FDI, including Greenfield, Brownfield, M&A. It focuses just on larger projects. The Financial Times data does not restrict the projects to any size. They, in principle, are trying to track all FDI projects, but just Greenfield FDI. So they're not really looking at M&A or brownfield FDI. So a lot of the analysis, we're going to focus on the Greenfield FDI, which I think is fine because those are like the real new factories and new investments that I think are most meaningful in terms of development impact. Okay, so obviously the big advantage of using the project level data is that it just records the final destination and the original source. And you can kind of disaggregate some of the FDI numbers by sector or by source regions in China. And there's some employment data in the Financial Times data. We never used it because it's somewhat incomplete. And another thing we can do is, because it's not just project specific, but firm specific, we can link the data to firm level data in China, which we spent quite a lot of time doing using official Chinese firm registration data, so we can track back, whether they're state-owned enterprises. Some of the challenges of this data is that it's still noisy data, and it's going to lack full coverage of projects because basically both the data sources, they're trying to find evidence of the projects through online sources, through different reporting, company websites, government websites, media reports, and then they're compiling this list of projects, and then they're doing some work verifying. They have teams that kind of try to verify whether the investments actually occurred and whatnot to try to improve the quality. When we merge the data from the two sources, we do find, there's some overlap, but also quite a lot of non-overlap, which means one group is finding some projects, the other. So I'm sure the data is still incomplete, but the data collection method has been consistent over time. So I think we can still learn something. And I think it's the only data that's really appropriate to doing this. Okay.
Yeah, so Merlin Boone, he has a question for you, Albert.
Sure. Hi, Merlin.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for taking my question. I was wondering about how you defined SOEIC main owners state-owned. Did you account for variation within the different levels of government ownership? And is that a majority-minority ownership or pure just out of the state?
We define it as majority, but we do work tracking the ownership through multiple layers. In other words, in the firm registration data, you can see who the owners are, and sometimes the owners are other companies, but those companies may also be mixed ownership. So then we can go to that company's registration data and see who owns that company and track it up as many layers as is needed till we get to owners that we can clearly classify as private or state. So that's what we do. And then after we do that, if it's more than 50%, we call it state-owned. I don't think the results are that different if you look at the fully state-owned and the majority state-owned.
And one more question, Albert. Have you ever taken the list of these investments to the recipient countries? Somebody that, like in their, I don't know, in their department, their Bureau of Economic, Ministry of Economy, and say, how complete is this?
Yes, we've done that actually. We did our project with United Overseas Bank was in Southeast Asia. So we did case studies in 6 countries. In some of the countries, we had a postdoc who was specializing in this research, and she tried to improve the quality of our data by and there were mistakes. There were type 1 and type 2 errors. I think for the most part, the large projects are not missed. But sometimes maybe a project is listed, but never happened for some reason, got canceled, or there's some projects that may have been missed. But I don't think it was too bad. I can probably document that a little bit more carefully for a few countries, and then that would probably be useful to report to make people more comfortable with the data. Okay, all right, so let's get to some results. So this is just a plot of the average. So this is kind of country year data. So the average across countries in the Greenfield FDI Greenfield FDI per country per year. And you can see the blue lines are the Belt and Road countries, the yellow is the non-Belt and Road countries. And so for the Greenfield FDI, you can see there's a big jump in investment in 2000, especially 2015 and 16, which you don't see in the non-Belt and Road countries. And the construction projects, the Belt and Road countries already were getting a lot more construction projects. So construction projects are not FDI. Usually they're just, you know, someone's paying China to build a bridge or something. It's a contract, not an equity stake. And if we do kind of a simple regression where we try to look at the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, basically by dating the Belt and Road Initiative as being all the years after 2013, and then interacting kind of a post dummy with a Belt and Road dummy and including country fixed effects and allowing for differential pretends for Belt and Road countries and non-Belt and Road countries, then we estimate that Greenfield FDI increased by 95% more in Belt and Road countries than in non-Belt and Road countries after the initiative. And construction projects increased by 15%. And if you look at where the money is going, South Asia and Southeast Asia, and to some extent the Middle East, are receiving most of the outbound FDI and construction projects under the initiative.
So that's Pakistan and Bangladesh?
Right. Well, Pakistan is one of the biggest country recipients. Russia is actually also big, but not in these three regions. Indonesia is also one of the top recipients. Bangladesh, I don't think it's one of the top recipients, but they are most of the countries in South Asia are Belt and Road countries. India is even a Belt and Road country, but they've basically resisted taking Chinese money. And we also find that after the Belt and Road Initiative, the resource this means energy and minerals, accounted for nearly half of the Greenfield investment. Okay, so we're gonna do some simple cross-country regressions. As an applied microeconomist, I'm kind of ashamed to be running cross-country regressions, but we're really gonna focus on, so I mean, if you're looking for a fancy causal strategy, identification strategy, you're not gonna get it here. We're just going to look at the correlates of FDI across different countries in the world. And actually, we're going to start the data 2010, not 2003. We have data 2003, but we're going to focus on a before-after comparison. 2010 to 2013 is the pre-period, and then 2014 to 2017 here. But we've extended the data to 2019, and so the results here may not reflect the data, but it doesn't really change any of the qualitative results. And so we're considering a few types of covariates. One is a set of variables which we describe as economic fundamentals. So GDP per capita, the level, and also the growth rate, the population size, exchange rate, distance, and an export sophistication measure. And we have one measure of resource endowment, natural resources endowment as a share of GDP. And then we have one cultural variable, the share of Chinese in the population. And then we have a set of governance variables that we take from the World Bank. And they publish an index for these 6 dimensions of governance every year for every country. And we can look at those elements individually, but then we often can combine them into one overall governance index and look at the impact of that. Okay, and the basic results here, I'm not going to put up lots of regression tables to stare at. What we find is that the importance of economic fundamentals has declined. If you compare, so for example, here, you look at the GDP per capita growth coefficient in these regressions in the pre-period and the post-period. And you can see for the Greenfield FDI, it's marginally significant and positive before the Belt and Road Initiative. and close to zero after the initiative. And the coefficient for construction projects also declines substantially, although neither is statistically significant when we control for everything else. Okay, so that's one message, that it seems like the money is not going as much to places that kind of the basic economic fundamentals would predict.
Albert.
And the second, yeah.
So what are the countries included in the sample?
All countries in the world.
Actually, including US, right? US, Europe.
Yes. Yes.
All I mean, have you done anything like only for the poor countries?
We have done it. Well, we've done regressions separately for the Belt and Road countries and the non-Belt and Road countries. We kind of felt that this is more meaningful in the sense that, the Belt and Road countries is affecting the overall allocation of, FDI across the world. And it's a fair kind of reflection of the distortions or the motivations of FDI. Although we've done a different way. We've also controlled for whether you're a Belt and countries and not controlled. These results are not controlling for whether you're a Belt and Road countries. That actually doesn't seem to have a big effect. I think the governance results are robust to just looking at Belt and Road countries, although we lose power, of course, because we just have fewer countries when we do that. And this sample, I think, is, I don't know, 140 countries. I forget I don't have the regression tables here, but yeah. So that's the answer to your question.
Yeah, I have a question about how to interpret the results.
Sure.
You're showing how the relative importance of these different factors or potential determinants has changed.
Right.
At first I thought, well, does this mean that the relative profitability has changed? But then I guess it's hard to say that if, in a sense, you're taking into account economic fundamentals. So right. I'm wondering how we interpret these changes. Or
I think the way I try to interpret it is that this is kind of describing kind of what's motivating the investment. It says nothing about the profitability or the returns to these projects, so we just don't know. I mean, it takes a while to know what the returns to any infrastructure or FDI project is.
But then it raises an interesting question as to why the motivations would have changed. But maybe that's beyond your assessment, but it seems to leave open an interesting question.
Right, I can speculate. I will speculate on it in a second, but yeah, I mean, the results are the results, so they're open to interpretation, obviously. And finally, the importance of resources increases, especially for construction projects. So that's kind of the results on the determinants. So I'm going to go through some results for the SOEs, and then I'll come back to kind of interpreting the.
Albert, real quick, for the natural resources, I mean, that's the one that's such a big issue. Is that statistically different from? I mean,
probably not.
Okay.
These two coefficients? No,
yeah.
I doubt it.
Yeah. So they've always been interested in that, but maybe a little bit more now, right?
Right. I think it's going to be a focal issue for how people assess the initiative going forward. And I think also with the reinvigoration of climate change as a topic that the US is now engaging in, I think it will also lead China. That will affect, I think, also how China approaches the initiative. Okay. So for SOEs, I explained already how we match the data and how we define it. So let me just show you some results. This is just looking at the share of FDI that is being invested by state enterprises. So these are percentages on the y-axis here. And so if you look at, for all countries, you can see that the SOE share of investment of outbound FDI has fallen from something like 70% to something more like 50%. If you compare before and after, there's a little bit less difference for Belt and Road countries. The decline is more in the non-Belt and Road countries for total FDI. If you look at the Greenfield FDI, which is kind of our focus, it's a similar pattern. You actually see a slight increase in the share of state SOE investment in the Belt and Road countries and a decrease in the non-Belt and Road countries. And for Greenfield FDI, it's for all countries, it hasn't changed that much. It seems stuck at around 60%. Now, there's a big difference in the resource FDI and the non-resource FDI. The state is much more involved in the resource-related FDI, so those percentages are over 80%. These are as a share of the capital. So, I mean, a lot of the SUE projects are the big projects. So there's still quite a lot. If you just counted the number of projects, then probably more projects are, a clear majority of projects are being done by private firms, but the big ones are mainly being done by the SOE ones. And then it's interesting, if you look at the non-resource Greenfield FDI, you do see that in the Belt and Road countries, there really is a very big, there's actually an increase as well here in the SOE share after the Belt and Road initiative, and kind of the opposite in the non-Belt and Road countries. So the state is an important part. There's still a significant role of private capital, but the state has, the state importance has, I think, been, overall has been fairly consistent, hasn't gotten bigger or smaller, although it may differ somewhat by sector.
So Albert, so if you do the same figure for China's domestic investment, will it look the same or different?
I would guess the state investment would be much smaller domestically, right? I mean,
even for resources?
Oh, for resources, maybe not.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this hides a lot of diversity in the sectors of projects, obviously. I mean, at least in Southeast Asia, there's a huge push by China's high-tech companies to do FDI projects in the kind of more dynamic economies of Southeast Asia. So, Alibaba and Huawei, and they're all involved doing various things. Some of them, doing internet commerce types of initiatives, and some of them in the infrastructure side, helping to build smart cities and whatnot. And we have some data on, we have more breakdown on the sectors that we've been working at. So we're trying to harmonize the sector definitions in the project data and in the firm data, so we can say a little bit more about sectors. But the data is nice, but it's still limited in amount and still noisy in terms of the year-to-year bumpiness of the amounts. So, but I think people are interested to know kind of more about the nature of these events. So we'll be doing that, I think, but I don't have those results right now, unfortunately. Especially trying to be a bit more granular in describing the nature of the state-owned enterprise investment in which sectors and the private investment. Okay, so some of the results. How am I doing on time, by the way?
You probably are 10 minutes.
Okay.
You can, yeah, and then.
Okay, good. I think I can get through. So I want to just get to the sentiment analysis. So this is just some bullet points on other results from we did some analysis separately for the determinants of state enterprise investment and private investment. So you can see private firm investment increased more in the Belt and Road countries than SOE investment. If you kind of do a similar type of regression where you control for various things, it's not as apparent in the descriptive disk that I gave you, but in the regression, it comes out a bit stronger. The SOE share of OFDI is smaller in faster growing, better governed countries. And compared to SOEs, private firms are much more responsive to governance than state enterprises, but the increase in the importance of governments, which was one of the results from the previous analysis, is true for both state enterprises and private firms, okay? And private firms generally seem to be more responsive to other variables as well, okay? So just a couple of final thoughts on this part of the analysis. So I think that this declining importance of economic fundamentals suggests that non-economic objectives are increasingly motivating the outbound FDI under the Belt and Road Initiative. I think it does raise some questions that, that China probably needs to be vigilant if it wants to make sure that a lot of these projects are not bad projects, because they don't seem to be responding to fundamentals. And the other thing is, I think the results on governance really suggest that this narrative of state-led exploitation really isn't supported. Because if China was trying to exploit weak governments, they should be directing Belt and Road investments to the poorly governed places that they can, easily trap them in debt. And you don't see them. I think because there's such a push to increase investments in the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of companies are being told, especially state enterprise, that we expect you to make an investment in a Belt and Road country, even if they've never made an investment before. Then they tend to actually focus more on the governance. They really want to avoid the basket case countries. And so I think that maybe is consistent with that, but it's not consistent with this exploitation narrative, I think. Okay, so that's kind of my interpretation of the results that I promised to bring this to. Okay, I want to get to the sentiment analysis because this is the newest stuff. And I don't know, so we use some machine learning methods. I don't know how familiar you are with it, but I'm going to go just quickly through the methodology. So basically, we have a lot of media articles about China, and we want to train an AI model to read that text of each article and identify whether it reflects positive or negative sentiment towards China. And it's going to produce for every article a probability of whether the article is positive rather than negative. So it's going to lead to a score of something from 0 to 1, the AI algorithm. So if it's less than 0.5, it's more likely to be a negative article. If it's more than 0.5, it's more likely to be a positive article. Okay, so how do we do that? We get this data from the GDELT project. This is publicly available. They monitor all of the world's website news, and they provide a data set of links to every article, basically, that's published online. And so for this project, we kept all of the links that contain China or Beijing in the metadata. So that's a pretty broad sweep. Anything about China is included. And then this leads to a total number of links, covering this 2013 to 2020 period of over nearly 8 million. When we actually go to try to download all of those links, we are successfully able to basically download the article and clean them in about 1 million cases. So, so website links obviously are not permanent, and some have paywalls and other things. So I'm told this is about what you would expect, but obviously there's going to be some sample selection issues. Okay. So then what we do is we train the model. So we tag a bunch of articles. We have thousands of articles, not millions of articles, not hundreds of thousands. We hire real people to read the articles and classify them in different ways. So first, they categorize whether the article is meaningful or not. Is it a keep or a noise? If it's like about, a Chinese recipe for some dish, that's not going to be meaningful. So that would be noise and gets tagged right away, and then nothing else is asked. And then in addition to the noise keep, the main variable is the last one here, which is the sentiment. The reader will assess whether it's a positive article, a negative article, or a neutral article towards China. And then we also ask them to code in if the article is about specific industries or is about specific general topics, and we can feed that into the AI algorithm to give it a little bit more data to predict whether the sentiment is positive or negative. Okay, so one of the collaborators on this project is Gunter Lomas, who is actually, Lauren Brandt is one of his advisors, not his supervisor, but he's a PhD student at Toronto who, works with a lot of the AI guys. They're one of the leading groups over in Toronto on AI. So anyhow, we use a neural network kind of algorithm. So it's smart, it's a Ludwig package. It's a deep learning model that starts with an understanding of language that's already been programmed earlier, but then, you know, it's trained on the articles and the data we feed it in the training data set. So we divide the articles that we tag or read, 80% we use to train the algorithm, and we keep 20% to test the accuracy of the algorithm, which is, I think, standard. And then these are the ones we tagged. So it's something like 30,000 plus articles, and a bunch of them are noise, right? And then the other ones, a lot of them are neutral, but then we get these positive and negative articles. And then we can kind of focus on the ones that are predicted to be keep and are clearly positive or clearly negative. And we use that, the data, those articles, to train the AI bot to distinguish between positive and negative sentiment. And so this is just the number of articles that are in the training and the numbers that we keep, we don't touch and just use to test. And this is something called a confusion matrix. It basically shows among, so the left-hand side, negative, positive, is, the rows here are the true, whether it's true, negative, or positive, and then the columns are the prediction of the AI algorithm after it's been trained. This is on the test sample. And so you can see that it does quite a good job. And, you know, it's a 90% precision, which is, I think, quite good for these types of algorithms. And then once we are happy with that the bot has been well trained, then we release it on the entire data set and then calculate the sentiment for 1 million articles, right? And then, okay, so that's it. And then I'm just going to show you some descriptions about the sentiment. So these are media articles. I'm going to show you some descriptions of the sentiment towards China in different regions of the world, and then do a few initial, still highly preliminary regressions and show you the results. Okay, so these are the sentiment towards regions which I guess are mainly non-BRI regions. So North America, unfortunately doesn't include the US. We didn't do the US because there's so many articles in the US that we decided to save resources and not do the US, but we will add the US. I'm sure there's a ton of interest now. But you can see that the sentiment towards China is just plummeting in Canada and Mexico. Probably even more in the US. And then Europe is much better. It's actually increasing in the early periods, but been declining for the last several years of this data. Latin America, it seems to be on a gentle decline, and Oceania also declining somewhat sharply, especially in the recent years. So this is, you know, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Okay, now what about some of the places that are getting more of the Belt and Road investments? And I actually was looking at the data, and I should put the Middle East here too, not Eastern Europe probably. But what you can see is in Southeast Asia, you actually see, you know, flat and then, you know, a bump up in 2017 and then a decline in the last couple of years. In South Asia, it's also a gentle decline and a little bit more in 2019. Eastern Europe sees a bump up and then again, decline. And Central Asia is the one country, one region where you see it, it actually seems to be, it's very high and increasing. I mean, it's worth noting that 0.5 is kind of the expected positive versus negative, right? So the Southeast Asia and South Asia are really close to 0.5 and then following a bit below 0.5. Okay, and then the last regions we have here are Africa, which seems somewhat stable and positive, you know, like 0.65 range. Middle East is declining. This is actually getting a fair amount of Belt and Road money, going from like 0.65 down to less than 0.5. And then East Asia, which is the small group, this is like Japan, Korea, Mongolia, I think, seems more stable. Okay, now what about some of the big Belt and Road countries? These are, I think, the 3 biggest Belt and Road investment recipients. And it doesn't look that great, actually. I mean, Indonesia, you see a jump up after the Belt and Road Initiative begins, but then it's been, you know, declining since then, and it's well below 0.5. Pakistan, which is like China's best friend in the world, long time close ally of China. A high sentiment, but also declining really since the initiative began. And there has been a lot of politics in Pakistan about, the Chinese investment and discussion.
Say, Al?
Yes.
Have you tried to explicitly correlate the relationship between the magnitude of the Belt and Road FDI and the changes in sentiment over time?
Yes, I'm going to show you that in 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Those will be my last results.
Okay.
Thanks for the
Albert,
segue.
so
Yeah.
are these all English media outlets?
I had thought my co-author Gunter, who did most of the number work, sent me some slides, and it does say it's the English articles. I had thought we had talked about doing the, because you can Google Translate the non-English articles pretty readily. And so I thought we were doing the non-English articles as well. So I sent him an email right away. I said, I thought we were, so I haven't heard back from him. Literally, we're doing this.
It'll be different,
so
right?
I think it very well may be just the English articles.
English articles will be very, very different from in China, from Chinese articles, totally different.
Yeah,
in China,
that may be the case.
So
if we haven't done it, we will, because I think we definitely should do the non-English.
If you had to guess, just for if the average of everything that you looked at is 0.5, if you looked at the local language, what would it be? 0.6 or 0.4? Or do you have?
I would say it would be lower.
Okay, got it.
But that's completely speculation on my part.
Got it. Okay, got it. That's what I think too. Mm.
Yeah. And finally, if you just look descriptively at Belt and Road countries and non-Belt and Road countries, it actually doesn't look all that different, although you can see that from the starting point, it's lower in Belt and Road countries. So if you reference it to the starting point in 2013, the year before the initiative, then actually there's probably a slightly greater decline in the Belt and Road countries than in the non-Belt and Road countries, right? No, I'm sorry, that would be the opposite. Right, the opposite of that. But okay, that's just descriptively. Then we can put some structure on the day. So, so here's the results that Larry kind of was asking for. Although, this is the between estimate. So this is the cross-country. So we do like a fixed effects model, and we can look at the between effects and the within effects. And the within effects are all insignificant, which is unfortunate, which means that within a country, trying to find a significant relationship between the growth in FDI and the change in sentiment, maybe it's a bit too noisy, one or both of these variables to really capture that. We don't get any results. If you look cross-sectionally, it's very clear that FDI is inversely correlated with sentiment. So countries that receive more FDI from China show a more negative sentiment towards China. Not a very good message for the soft power, and the overall trends, of course, of declining sentiment towards China is also not very good for China's soft power. If you look, there's a couple of breakdowns here where we divide the FDI, for instance, into resource FDI and non-resource FDI. And you can see it's the resource FDI that is correlated negatively with sentiment, not the non-resource FDI. If we put the construction variable in, it's also similarly negative. When we put construction and Greenfield FDI, it's the construction one that's more negative or more significant, although marginally so. Actually, the magnitudes are pretty similar. And then if we divide FDI into SOE FDI and non-SOE FDI, we see also that the negative effect is more for the SOE FDI and not the non-SOE FDI. So, it's these countries that are getting a lot of resource state-led investment where you see more of the negative correlation. Okay, now, one thing we do, which is also trying to capture the time dimension, I think that kind of was the spirit of Larry's question, is we do like basically a difference in difference estimate where we use a post variable. The limitation there is that we only have 1 year of pre here for 2013, and we have many years of post. But if we really take the 2013 data seriously as a baseline, we can do like a diff and diff, comparing the differences with 2013. And then we can also use that, we can use that variation also as we can use the post times BRI interaction as an instrument to identify the change in FDI associated with initiative and how that affects sentiment. Okay, so here's the last table of results I'm going to show you today. It's very weak, you know, it's not a whole lot of observation, still very noisy. But one thing you see is that if you do this, if you compare the OLS to the IV on the effect of Greenfield FDI on sentiment, for the OLS, it's close to 0. If we use the IV, and the first stage of the IV is here on the far right column, then we do get a marginally significant negative coefficient. The first stage is weak, so we haven't corrected for the weak instrument yet. Literally did this late last night. And if you, so I mean, this is just your standard diff and diff setup in the first stage where, you know, we look at Greenfield FDI and control for trends and allow for differential trends in Belt and Road countries and non-Belt and Road countries, and look at the interaction of post and whether you're a Belt and Road country. And this is like an 80% increase in investment if you're in a Belt and Road country after the initiative. When we did this before with the full data, where we take the data all the way back to 2010, the magnitude is similar. It's much more significant because we have more data. Okay, so this is suggestive again of a negative impact of.
Albert.
Yes.
Oops. Can Mike McFall has a question. Do you want him to ask it now, or do you want to summarize in 1 minute and then go to Q&A? Mike, why don't you ask it, Mike?
Yeah, why don't you ask it?
Yes.
Well, first of all, great talk. I want to go way back to the beginning, though.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Sure.
So I want you to dig in a little more on, even if you have to speculate about the causal relationship between the determinants part. On the first, I'm remembering you had 3 different graphs there. On the first part, you said very weak with economic fundamentals. Well, that's a really big basket of possible alternative explanations. So what do you think it is? If it's not economics, what is it? And have you thought about some other variables you might mix with that? That's on your first, on the left-hand side. Second, on the governance side, I want you also to get into that, if you could, a little bit. And I realize you're using bank data and not, say, Freedom House scores. So maybe that's on purpose. But your second chart, when you show those things, makes it look like China is exporting democracy. And that's pretty counterintuitive. That is not, I'm a political scientist. I work on international relations, and the conventional hypothesis is exactly the opposite. I can think of some alternative explanations for why you got that causal relationship. One might be that they just started with proximate, you know, South Asia, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. Those are all where weaker governance or autocracies are. And then they eventually got to more democratic countries. So that would be one explanation over time. It has nothing to do with kind of a grand strategy. But could you say a little bit more about that? And maybe, you know, maybe you should think about using Freedom House scores as an alternative to look at that. Governance gets into some messy things, as you know, right? And if you could show that there's no correlation between BRI investment strategy and regime type, that's a pretty big finding that I would actually try to pull out of this massive data set and publish in and of itself. And then last thing, you know, the folks that work on, and you made a joke about it. So, and I haven't read this literature for a long time. I used to teach it, but you know, there's a big literature on the correlates between the governance, you know, the World Bank governance findings and economic growth and development, right? You alluded to that in the beginning of your talk, but your results show something that is tension between those two things. You know, on the one hand, you're showing there's not a relationship with economic outcomes with BRI, and then the second one, you're showing there is a relationship going up with governance. And that just seemed a bit of a puzzle to me, but that's a lesser thing. I'm really interested in this notion, is China exporting democracy? And help us understand if that's true. Why is that the case?
Okay, so thanks. That's a very stimulating question. I don't think China is exporting democracy by any means. So you're kind of, obviously these are just correlations. So it is saying that investments are going to places that are better government, but I've always thought of it as the other direction of causality, although you're right, it doesn't really speak to causality per se. So your interpretation is certainly as valid as mine, but I kind of feel that it's more that as there's been a lot of emphasis on doing more investment in Belt and Road countries by the government, it's been heavily promoted that firms have some choices to make, and they tend to still try to avoid the basket cases. So in Southeast Asia, where we have more in-depth knowledge, the countries that get the most investment in Southeast Asia are still the better governed countries, like Malaysia, right. Indonesia. I mean, the poor, the poorer countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, still get much less Chinese investment. So I think that, I don't think they're making Malaysia democratic or making Indonesia democratic, but I think more money is gone there during the initiative.
Right.
So that would be my interpretation. I mean, I'm not sure that necessarily answers your question. Now, about the Freedom House data, I think at one point we tried to look at that, but I feel like the coverage both time and over and across countries was not as complete. So we were losing a lot of observations, but I think we can take another look at that. I mean, maybe because initially when we started doing this work, we're using data going way further back, all the way back to 2003. So maybe if we focus on a more recent period, the data will be more complete and we could do that. But what is so you're saying you could publish something on the political regime, but what is your prior about what to expect? What would you have expected?
Well, no, I actually agree with you. I think the causality is the other way around, right? So that's not the way you presented it. You said the determinants were driving. Well, actually, it doesn't. You're right. It's correlation. So let's not get into that. But I would just say in my world where people are debating this in policy circles, right? You may have forgotten, it was an ancient history, but the Trump administration said that the CCP is seeking to export autocracy all over the world. They're seeking to expand their model of governance all over the world. Your data shows the exact opposite, that they're actually seeking to invest in places with good governance. And again, you got to figure out how you hold true for correlation. That's a complicated thing that you're more competent at than I am. But I think that's a really big finding. That would, I think, have a real, just that one little piece to say that there's not a correlation here, that there's no evidence of exporting autocracy through BRI. That cuts against a lot of kind of public policy chatter about BRI that I've been reading. So I think I would highly encourage you to, some way carve that out and put that out there in the public domain as soon as you can.
Okay, yes.
Albert, can we, okay, why don't you finish one more slide and then we can take one or two more questions.
Yeah, so final thoughts. Just to tie things up a little bit, at least about how I've been thinking about the BRI initiative. Having gone to now quite a lot of countries and talking to people about Belt and Road projects, and also from the data, I think it's definitely the case that the initiative is supporting development efforts in countries around the world and is not exploiting poor countries. That's not what's driving it. But there are concerns that the investments are not being driven by economic fundamentals, and they're not increasing China's soft power. If anything, they're hurting China's soft power. And that's a huge failure from the Chinese perspective. They're doing all of this. Of course, they have their own economic interests, but there's also a lot of political, I think, objectives in being a good source of investment funds for all of these countries. And so I think China has to prioritize improving the implementation of the BRI projects. which I think is recognized. And that means really maintaining high standards of project management, project selection, promoting green development, and really being conscious of social impact. So being self-governing, basically. I think the problem that China has had, actually, it's not that they're trying to manipulate local governments, but that they defer too much to the local governments in some cases, because many local governments also, don't care about the environment, don't worry about the governments, not the people. And it gets them into trouble time and time again, where they start financing bad projects and environmentally damaging projects, or they don't really. So I think they just need to be disciplined themselves, not do stuff to just do whatever the local government wants to do, but really try to look forward and avoid all of these problems, and to try to have a much more positive image about the types of projects that they're implementing, and that they're really trying to do projects that are beneficial broadly to the local communities. Okay, so I'll stop.
Say, Albert, real quick, would you say that when you're doing your interviews, your qualitative interviews there, because this sort of reflects on what you found in the statistical work. In your qualitative interviews, does this also come out?
Absolutely. Okay. I think, it's very interesting. Different countries are very different, but especially countries that either historically have not had close ties to China or had some historical distance, or just not much experience with China. Those countries often have a very negative view of the new Chinese investments, the people, and many of the business community as well, that, the way the Chinese do business, because sometimes they're comparing Chinese business practices to like Korean and Japanese, especially in places like Thailand and Vietnam. And the Chinese companies have not done very well in those comparisons. Just like in the US, the anti-China thing is exploited politically in many of these countries, right? When there's contested politics in these countries, one side is often criticizing the government for being too close to China, right? And if the government is close, and then so it gets used that way too. So just like a lot of the crazy coverage of China now in the Western media, in the US media, I think you also get some bad projects or some specific events will get a ton of attention and really turn sentiment, even though there may be a lot of good projects or important development projects also occurring in those very same countries. So that maybe, this is all purely anecdotal and as a quantitative, I take it kind of with a grain of salt, but I think.
Yeah, Albert, we want to keep going on, and we want to get you over, come back home and give a talk and interact with us in person next fall, we hope. I want to thank everyone for coming today again, and Albert, thank you. That was spectacular, very interesting.
Thanks everyone, pleasure.